The way in which one sees themselves is critical to the way in which one views the world. There's a sense of comfortability when a person can relate to another based on a commonality between the two of them. Before one can identify in the social context, however, it's important to learn how to personally identify. This personal identity is what makes a person who they are. It's their morals, their ethics, values. Following this, there's a definition of self that surfaces. So then the social identification then is the basis of any human relationship. It's a sense of commonality, as mentioned before, or even like a social categorization that facilitates like a distinct social grouping. So as a future teacher, it's important to be aware of these to best facilitate the best positive learning experience that one can in the classroom. It's also important to understand how others identify socially so that we can be respectful and inclusive of the diverse people. So in reading Passing by Nella Larson, it takes place in Harlem, New York in the 1920s. So Irene Redfield and Claire Kendry are two of the main characters that kind of foil each other a little bit. And they do this over the social issue of racial passing. So Irene identifies more as black, with a black husband, 2 black sons, and then Claire identifies more as white, has a white husband and a white daughter. However, they're both light-skinned enough that they're passable, what is considered passable. So passing basically is when people with black backgrounds can pass for a white person without the knowledge of other people around them. So this is kind of just the premise of the book and the issues that surface with the social identification here. So Claire and Irene meet up with a friend sometime for lunch and tea, and then Claire decides she wants to have a taste of what her black culture is. So she invites herself to a dance hosted by the Negro Welfare League, which her friend Irene is putting on. And so at this dance, Claire is able to identify with her black culture, which is new to her because she normally passes as white. And she doesn't get caught or anything. She's able to go see her black culture and then return to her white family and her white community in Europe, basically, where she lives. And then later on in the novel, her friend Irene is out on a shopping trip with another black friend. And Irene sees Claire's husband, Jack, who's the white man, and therefore exposing Irene as black to Jack, which then Jack knows now that Claire is black as well, because generally who you hang out with in that time is who you socially identify with. And therefore it exposes Claire as being black to Jack. And Jack is very racist. He's not a very accepting person, and therefore when they're at a party later, he socially outs Claire as a black woman. He actually says a dirty nigger. And so just the outburst of that, Claire's whole identity shatters and falls apart in that moment, and she then plummets out the window to her death. So whether that's on purpose, if somebody pushed her, or whether it was a suicide, is kind of unclear in the book. But the fact that her whole identity had crashed and crumbled underneath her because she was living a lie and not true to her social identity as a black woman. So that's kind of the general gist of Passing, the novel. Me, myself, I identify socially as a white female, obviously, but also I identify with my Christian upbringing. So my family was Mennonite growing up, which is just a very conservative form of Christianity. And my parents decided to go to a more modern church instead. And so we still held some of those traditional viewpoints, but in our worship style, we had more of a modern church, so we were no longer Mennonite. But as we were growing up, we would still visit our grandparents and their Mennonite church and all of our cousins and everything. And so it kind of reminded me when we would go to visit of more of like a religious passing style, to where we were not Mennonite, but when we went back, we acted and dressed and talked the same way as a Mennonite would. That was more out of respect, but it kind of reminded me of Passing a little bit, just because in that moment we were identifying with a different social culture, I guess. And so it was even more so when we would go to visit our Amish relatives, which is another generation up. We would just act differently. And it was kind of interesting. And so when I went off to college, kind of a critical moment in my life was when you leave your parents' house and you can decide for yourself how you want to act and behave and what you believe, in essence. And so coming here, I decided recently to start going to more of a conservative church and kind of identifying back with my Mennonite roots. So at church we'll like wear long skirts, we'll sing out of hymnals and stand to read our Bibles. And it's really neat to be able to appreciate that upbringing and that different way of identifying, kind of resurfacing from when I was younger. And so that's kind of what it reminds me of between the two novels, just the racial passing and the religious passing that can go on there depending on how you socially identify yourself and with who you identify yourself. So in the classroom, it's easier for people to pretend and look like someone they're not. And so we need to be socially accepting as teachers and to accept our students so that they don't feel like they need to pass for someone else. That ultimately will create a better learning environment overall when students can be comfortable to identify personally as they please and therefore identify socially how they would like to and with who they hang out with and what kinds of things they learn and just to create a better learning environment for our students. And so that's how I relate passing with my teaching in the future and kind of like my self-identity in that as well. Thank you.